All right, welcome everyone. I think this is maybe KDLA's first webinar of 2021. Welcome. This is Charlie Taylor. I'm one of the continuing education consultants here at KDLA. Welcome to Podcasting Demystified. You will notice a little bit, if you've attended our webinars in the past, a little bit of a change in our webinar presentation here. This is our new program, Blackboard Collaborate. Just want to go over again how to chat in case anybody missed it. Definitely want you guys to be involved in today's presentation, have it active. So in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a little purple arrow. You just click on that and it will expand the panel. And then there, down at the very bottom, you'll see the chat bubble. You just click that to open the chat panel and you can just type your message in there. And that is how you'll be interacting with our presenters today. If you have any questions for them, comments, anything you'd like to add about your experience with podcasting, any questions. And there's Alicia, our other city consultant. Hi. All right. And also, if you have any technical issues, as I said, we are brand new to this webinar program, but I will be working behind the scenes to resolve any of those issues as best as I can. So please feel free to use that chat pod. We will be providing you with full-size copies of these slides at the end of the webinar. I did send out that handout that has kind of the shrunken down version for note-taking, but we'll be providing the full-size version at the end of the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting it to our archived webinars page within about a week's time. We'll also be sharing it out to anybody who registered but didn't attend, so please feel free to share this webinar recording with anyone that you think will be interested. If there's somebody at your library that you want to work with on creating a podcast, that would be great. Please feel free to share it. All right, so let me switch over the screen. And we have 3 presenters today. First is Carrie Green from the Jessamine County Public Library. After that will be Miriam Otterat from the Lexington Public Library. And last but not least, Aaron West, also from Lexington Public. So I'm going to mute myself. And again, everybody, please feel free to use that chat pod for any questions. And Carrie, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm the user education librarian at the Jessamine County Public Library, and I'm going to be talking about our Books and Bites podcast today. And we've done this, recorded this podcast since December of 2016, so it is our longest running podcast so far. So, and can everyone hear me okay? Okay, thanks. Okay, so the podcast started off as an in-person program. It was an in-person book club, and we still meet the in-person book club. Even during the pandemic, we meet on Zoom. It's a no-pressure book club where we, the librarians leading the program, there's 3 of us, provide a themed list of books, and then participants share what they're reading. There's lots of friendly bookish conversation and, of course, snacks, because that always helps get people into the room. Now that we're meeting virtually, we say it's bring your own snacks. So the podcast began, the idea for it began during a programming meeting brainstorming session as a way to bring the content of the in-person program to patrons who might not be able to make it otherwise, which of course is something that we're all thinking about now. So the same 3 librarians who do the in-person program do record the podcast. And we start with the same in-person content of a theme, some books, but in order to get the bites part of our program name in there, we had to change it up a little bit, and we pair recipes with our books. So it could be either a dish or a beverage. And we try to highlight cookbooks from our collection when we choose our recipes. So these are the current Books and Bites staffers. Adam Wheeler is our teen outreach librarian, and Michael Cunningham is the user services associate. They have less available back time than I do, so I'm the person who handles all of the technical aspects, basically everything other than, they record with me. So that's why I'm here, and they're not, not because they're not valuable, but because I actually do most of the technical stuff that I think Charlie wanted us to talk about today. We do have very varied reading tastes, so I think that is also something to think about if you are thinking about a similar program. We do have some chatting in our podcast, but for the most part, we script our book reviews, and this helps us keep the podcast to around the same length each episode. We try to keep it about 30 minutes, and it also helps us prepare for the in-person program because we usually record the podcast beforehand. One thing I've discovered through editing is that the more chatting, the harder it can be to edit. So it also kind of helps on the editing side of the podcast. So this past year, we also added a reading challenge to both the in-person program and the podcast. And all of our club meetings and podcast episodes are organized around it. And the goal of the challenge is to encourage reading throughout the year. And participants who complete the different prompts on the challenge can enter to win prizes. So just as an example, our first prompt for this year was a book that's first in a series. So last year, like I said, was the first year we did this. And, we started in January and everything shut down in March. So we didn't have a huge amount of participation for that first year. So it's hard to tell, if that was because of a lack of interest or the pandemic. But we decided to do it again this year. We are organizing it a little differently with some monthly prize drawings in addition to the year-end drawing. So hopefully that will keep people submitting throughout the year. But at the very least, we felt like it helps us organize our year, so we know what we're going to do ahead of time and not, always scrambling to figure out what we want to talk about each month. So just some things to consider about why you should think about podcasting. And of course, the main reason we wanted to do it is for the potential to reach a larger audience. Our Books and Bites book club is fairly small. We have about 6 to 8 people who attend our in-person group. That tends to be about average for our book clubs in general. So with the podcast, and these are just averages, but we have on average about 33 podcast downloads per month per episode. Our numbers have been down a little since March. Before that, I'd say we got, anywhere up to 40 downloads an episode. But it's still, a much larger amount than we could do for an in-person program. We also, another great thing about podcasts is that you have a library of content that's always available to your patrons or really to anyone. we actually get about an average of 59 total downloads a month. And we've had as high as 100 downloads a month. And that's for, all of the episodes, not just the current episode. So, of course, pre-pandemic recording was pretty different than how we're currently recording. We are fortunate enough to have a recording studio in our library, and that's where we recorded the podcast before the pandemic. And it was also part of the reason that we wanted to start recording is to kind of showcase the equipment that we have in our recording studio. We used GarageBand to record and edit the podcast. And it was also attached to an 11-rack unit. I have recently been informed that the library is getting rid of all of our Macs. So it looks like we'll be using Cakewalk and a PC once we go back to recording in person. And I'll talk a little bit more about Cakewalk in a second. So we have 3 Shure microphones that we use to record the podcast. These are dynamic mics. And if you're new to microphones and podcasting, I personally like using dynamic mics rather than condenser mics because they just pick up the sound that's right in front of them. So it's much easier to edit if someone, coughs or sneezes or whatever. It's much easier to edit all that out when sound isn't bleeding through onto each other's tracks the way it does with condenser mics. And I think someone asked if our room is soundproof. It isn't soundproof, but it does have some baffling and things to help reduce sound. And then we also have a couple of pairs of headphones, and I do recommend at least the person recording to wear some headphones because it does help with what you can hear when you're editing. So our post-pandemic recording, we have been recording remotely using a program called Squadcast. And that allows the 3 of us to record wherever we may be. Some of us are working from home, some of us are at the library. So it allows some flexibility there. With the plan that we have, which is the most basic, we get 2 hours of recording per month, which is plenty for us. It records up to 4 people, with each recorded on a separate track. So that's really good too and helps with editing. It also has some automatic backups. So our plan is $10 a month, but there is a discount for nonprofit and government organizations. I actually just found out about it when I was looking up the price again for this session, and they applied a 3-month coupon to our account for 3 months free. So I'm not sure, if it was just 3 months or if we're going to get free from now on, but that would be really nice. And then because our other mics required an XLR cable to connect to the 11-rack, we did have to invest in a couple of different mics. And these are USB mics that just plug right into all of our computers. They are condenser mics. Condenser mics tend to make the voice sound a lot nicer, I think. And since we're all recording separately, it doesn't matter if we have that sound bleed. Now, as far as the GarageBand and Cakewalk for editing, so we recorded an episode of the podcast yesterday, and so that was my first time using Cakewalk. It is very different from GarageBand. I didn't get a whole lot of training beforehand. This was the software that our tech services people chose. You know, I'm kind of struggling with it. I see that Aaron is going to be talking about Audacity. I know that's another free program. Cakewalk is a free editing program, so it does have that going for it. That's really all I can say about it at this point, is that I'm struggling through with it. I do find GarageBand to be fairly intuitive, so if you're lucky enough to have Macs in your library, I would recommend going with that. No, Gail, I definitely did not know all this information when I began. I learned as I went along. Some of it was, you know, we did get some training from our tech services people because, of course, this is equipment that we already have. But a lot of it I just found through doing it. And I'll talk a little bit more about some resources in a few more slides. Okay, sorry, I needed to take a little break there, or a little sip of water there. We use Transistor to host our podcasts, and it costs about $15.83 a month for our plan. We started off using SoundCloud, but SoundCloud limits you to one podcast per month, and so it was going to be more expensive when we started to think about adding other podcasts. And it made sense at that time to switch. And I've been happy with Transistor. It's pretty easy to use. It supports multiple podcasts. It does count downloads differently than SoundCloud by stricter industry standards. So our stats did take a little bit of a hit when we moved to Transistor, but of course they're more accurate now, and we certainly would rather that. So one of the great things about podcasts is that people can listen with whatever they're used to listening to. So we do have it available on our website. There's a nice little widget that Transistor provides that we're able to embed on our website. You also have to submit your podcast to Apple and Google if you want it to appear in those services. But once you do, especially once you submit it to Apple, most of the popular podcast players actually get their feeds from Apple, so it will automatically show up in most podcast players just from that. And then Transistor will submit the podcast to Spotify for you, so you don't actually have to do anything there. So it does take a little bit of work, I think, to get the word out there that you have the podcast. So here's just a few things that we have done to try and spread the word. One thing that we've used is a freemium app called Headliner, and that's the first image in this slide. It allows you to make audiogram videos using either excerpts or full episodes of your podcast. And the little lines at the top are actually animated, so it gives it, a little more visual interest. And we post these on our social media feeds and in our stories, our Instagram and Facebook stories. And you can see some samples on our Instagram page. I also do monthly blog posts, and these are basically, we list the books so that people can easily find them in our catalog, and we also list the recipes and the books that they come from. We've also done some experimenting with bringing Books and Bites to Facebook Live. We haven't done it in a while. We've had a lot going on our Facebook since March, as I'm sure you all have. But I do think this format has a lot of potential because it could allow for a little more interaction between patrons and librarians than the podcast does. And we also promote through monthly Next Reads newsletters, so people can sign up to get a monthly newsletter with all of the books that we talk about and a link to the podcast. So it does take some pretty extensive staff time, especially like I mentioned for me, because I'm doing most of the producing and editing. These are estimates, and it really varies from month to month. Of course, this month is going to be a lot longer since I'm using a new software. And it also doesn't include, of course, the reading time. I'd say it probably takes about a full day from start to finish. Now, post-production time has definitely gotten faster since I started. So, that's one thing to keep in mind is that you will get faster if you're just learning and just starting out. And one thing that I try to keep in mind is that professional podcasts have a whole team of editors and producers. So, when I saw the really long list of like 30 people as producers and for like a New Yorker podcast, it really helped me manage my own expectations of what I can do with just one. No, we're not printing the recipes. We refer people to the book or the website where we found them. We just talk about them and share them. So I think most people would agree we were providing free publicity for their cookbooks or their blogs. Sure, thanks for the question. So just a few tips and tricks about podcasting. I think the biggest hurdle is probably the sound of our own voices, and that was definitely an issue for me starting out. And I can just say you will get used to the sound of your own voice. I basically don't even blink when I'm hearing myself now, whereas before I would cringe, especially over all of the ums that you are getting to hear today too. The other thing is that lynda.com from LinkedIn is a great resource for podcasting tutorials. So if your library subscribes to Lynda, I would definitely recommend checking that out. I found the tutorials from Derek Chow to be especially helpful, and I wish that I had watch those tutorials much earlier than I did. And I kind of mentioned this already, but scripting at least some of the podcasts can help you keep focused and can also help a little with the editing time. So we do have a few other podcasts. However, they're not regularly and continuously updated like Books and Bites. The Jessamine History Walks are kind of like walking audio tours, and we've just done 2 episodes of those. They were cemetery walks. And we hope to do more of those, especially when the weather warms up. These do take a lot of preparation, so I wouldn't recommend doing that as a monthly podcast or anything like that. And our children's library has a parenting toolkit podcast. This is also a podcast that was tied to an in-person program where the children's programmer interviews experts about parenting issues. They are not doing that program now since the pandemic, so they haven't had a new episode in a while. But I think that was a pretty successful podcast for them in the short amount of time that they did the program. And that's all I had for today. If you have any other questions, and you can also feel free to email me at cgreen@justpublib.org. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie. Awesome presentation. You guys are doing a lot of great work. And I agree about the sound of your own voice. When we started recording webinars, it freaked me out.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carrie.
All right, thank you.
Looks like you covered all the questions. So if y'all think of any more questions for Carrie, she's going to stick around and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Our next presenter, let me bring up the slides. All right, our next presenter is Miriam Aderat from the Lexington Public Library. And Miriam, whenever you're ready, I'll mute myself and you can take over.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlie, for having me. It's great to be here, and thank you guys for joining us this morning. So yeah, I am Miriam Aderat. I hope everybody can hear me fine. So I've been a librarian with the Lexington Public Library since about 2013, I believe. So it's about 6 years. I've been working at the Central Library. Most of my time is in adult services and in the Kentucky room. So I started hosting the podcast in 2018. I believe that's when we started. That's when our first episode went up. After Sarah, the Kentucky room manager, and Aaron West, came up with the idea of having a podcast for the Kentucky room. Before we had other podcasts for the library, but we wanted one specifically for the Kentucky room. So getting started, I'm going to talk about sort of hosting, so the public side of our podcast. And Aaron is going to be talking about the technical front. So to get started, of course, you're going to need to come up with a title. And we kind of went back and forth we tried to get it like a catchy title, but in the end, we decided just to stay simple. These are, Tales from the Kentucky Room is literally, that's what our podcast is research coming out of the Kentucky Room. You want your title to convey what you want to talk about, but, make it simple and memorable. The other thing is that you want to define your audience. Who are you trying to reach? Is it everybody, all of the community that you guys serve, or is it something wider? So who do you want to reach with your podcast? So for us, it's going to be anybody that's interested in using the Kentucky Room, any kind of researchers, genealogists, anybody interested in Kentucky history, Lexington history. And I know Aaron has mentioned before that we've had, listeners from all over the world actually, but, that are interested in local Kentucky research. Next, you want to decide on what topics do you want to discuss. I think it's important to kind of narrow it down to a topic, but try not to make it too general. I feel like that will drown out your message and the information that you're trying to convey. So for us, we are sticking to Kentucky history, but that does not mean that you don't record current history. We do want to record what's going on currently for future generations, because that's going to be part of the history. So we talk about everything from, Lexington newspapers from the 1800s to current events that are going on, and to highlight current events. So make sure that, you don't pigeonhole yourself and be too narrow as well. So you don't want it too general, too narrow, something, try to make it a happy medium. What kind of format do you want? Is this going to be interview style? Are you going to have guests come on to your podcast? Do you want it to be more of a discussion style or a monologue, etc.? It can be all of the above, but just make a decision and make sure that you're comfortable doing all those formats, so that you're prepared and your podcast doesn't seem too forced, if you understand what I'm saying. And then make sure to can, of course, an intro and an outro. So, for the Kentucky Room podcast with the Tales from the Kentucky Room, we have the same intro, the introduction, and the same outro that we play at the beginning and the end of each episode. So it keeps it kind of uniform. Okay, so if you're going to have guests, so we do have a lot of guests come on our podcast. We invite them. And usually they are, it's research coming out of the Kentucky Room. So we usually have either staff that are working on interesting research, or our customers that we meet in the Kentucky Room, pre-pandemic, of course. So if we meet somebody in the Kentucky Room that's doing some really cool research, we kind of approach them and be like, hey, we have this podcast going. Would you like to come join us for the podcast to discuss what you're working on? We think that, that it's going to be, draw a lot of attention or draw a lot of interest. So some people that we've invited are like, Foster Ackerman. He's part of the Lexington Historical Society. We invited him to talk about the horse racing and his new book that had come out at the time. People like Lucy Jones. She is, she's a local blogger that does a lot of film and movie research around Harry Dean Stanton. And then our Swope and Goodlow podcast, it was called Going Postal, that was researched by a customer named Rand Dotson. He's a historian as well. And of course, Kevin Lane Derringer, he's a Broadway star and local Kentuckian that had released a book, and we invited him as well. So that's pretty cool. You can invite, there's cool people in your community that you want to highlight, go ahead and invite them. The other thing is when you do an interview or have a guest, you of course want to come up with questions for your guest. When you come up with questions, keep in mind that this is not a journalistic interview. This isn't like a investigative. You're not Barbara Walters or such things. But make sure that you're just providing like a good framework for the topic. Give your guests the opportunity to elaborate and highlight their work. So you're conveying information, correct, accurate information, of course, but you just want to help them highlight their work. And then don't be, it's important to have a script, I think, but nothing too rigid. Don't be too set in your script. Make sure you leave some room to maneuver for flexibility if your guest wants to discuss a topic that you hadn't thought of before. So don't be too forced because it's going to show. So be prepared, of course. And if you invite a guest that has published a book, make sure you read the book, at least, a few chapters in, and do your research so that, you are, you can portray the fact that you know what you're talking about. There's a question here that says, is this usually only one of you in the podcast? Do you have guests? So it is really about conversation. Yes, it is about conversation. So, I mean, scripting, I don't script. I do provide the questions. I write out questions and I send them to my guests, but I don't follow a script. it just gives me sort of, so a framework to work with. It's a guided one, like Erin mentioned, but it is still a conversation, yeah. So like I said, send your questions and your topic to your guests ahead of time so that they feel prepared and comfortable. And you want to maintain a good communication with your guest. Make sure that you have a back and forth before you guys are ready to record the podcast, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and they come prepared. But you also want to have a backup plan, because if your guests turn you down or don't show up at the last minute, make sure you can pivot and have a backup plan and be flexible. That has happened to us before, where we had a guest back out on us at the last minute, but they were gracious enough to send somebody in their place, and we were prepared and ready to pivot, and it worked out just fine. You're welcome, Gail. So recording. Like Carrie mentioned, we also have a digital studio in the Northside Library branch. We have a digital studio and we do record. So the picture that you see where it says how it started, that's me and Sarah Hubbard, the Kentucky Room Manager, and Erin West, our virtual librarian. So like I said, Erin's gonna go into the technical stuff, but with recording, you don't need to get too fancy, because as you can see, during the pandemic, I was literally recording from my closet, from my bedroom closet, just because it is the quietest room in the house, and it muffles out a lot of the sound. We also record in the closed stacks in the Kentucky Room, where we keep all of our, precious collection there too. So if we don't have a guest, if we're working with just staff, so a lot of times I have Wayne Johnson, who's a librarian, one of my colleagues, to discuss some of the research. So when we don't have an outside guest, we'll go record in the closed stacks, just because it's more convenient instead of having to travel to the Northside branch. You don't, like I said, you don't need to get fancy. Erin recently asked a guest to have a blanket or a towel ready in order to muffle out any sound, because even our digital studio is not really soundproof. So you just need a quiet space, a computer, a microphone, and maybe some headphones if you're doing the recording, like Erin. So how far in advance do we record? Erin, can you answer that? Yeah. So it really depends. Yeah, it depends on that. I'm going to let Erin actually talk about scheduling later on, so she can talk more about that. So some of my favorite podcasts that we've released, some guests that I've had on is Wayne Johnson. He is a colleague, and he's been with the library for, I would say, over 25 years. He is a newspaper and history buff of local history. My favorite ones that we've done with him is the Cassius Marcellus Clay podcast. That was a pretty fun one to do. It was very interesting. Wayne Johnson is, if you guys get to know him, you'll know he's a trivia buff. He really loves his history, and it's really awesome when I get to have a chat with him. Another guest that I enjoyed meeting is Peter Brackney. He was the author of Lost Lexington, and then most recently, The Murder of Geneva Hardman. Peter is always gracious, and I love having him, and I've actually, we've become sort of, I guess you can say, social media friends over the pandemic, discussing the detriments of quarantine with children. But he's a really cool guy, and he's really open to, helping libraries do programming and such. And I know he's done programming for other libraries as well. And of course, Tom Eblin, he is the former columnist and editor of the Lexington Herald Leader. He came on to talk about the history of Lexington newspapers. He was really cool to talk to. Just to wrap it up, so after you're done with recording, a podcast. Just be a gracious host. When you're during the podcast, when you're recording, just have I would suggest having like water, maybe some snacks ready for your guest if they wish, but always have water. You do a lot of talking, so the mouth is going to get dry, and it just helps, with easing some of the jitters, to have that. And then after the podcast, you do want to send a thank you note to your guests, just thanking them for being there, and taking time away from their own schedule to help you with a podcast. The other thing is, if you mention any articles or books in your podcast, make sure you link it into your description, okay? Just because it's helpful for your listeners. So, for example, if you mention an event or a specific article, make sure that the link is provided. And then scheduling your podcast, make sure that you're scheduling it in an appropriate time frame. So, for example, when we interviewed Peter Brackney about his book, The Murder of Geneva Hardman, we released the podcast around the same time that his book was being released. If we talk about events, like when we talked to Lucy Jones about the Harry Dean Stanton Festival and her research around that, we tried to do it around the time that the festival is happening. So just keep that in mind. And the other thing is that you do want to be consistent with releasing your podcast. We try to release podcasts every 3 weeks beforehand. During the pandemic, that wasn't as feasible. But Erin's going to talk about how we, schedule and release. So with that, I thank you for listening to me, and I will throw it over to Charlie so that Erin can talk about the technical side of things. Thanks, guys, for listening.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Great job. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think we covered all the questions that came in. Erin was definitely helping out with that too. So thank you again very much. I'm going to switch it over to Erin. She's going to follow up. Remember, Erin's also at Lexington, so these two are working together. Okay, and I'll turn it over to you, Erin.
All right, thanks. So I take care of the back end of 2 of our podcasts, well 3, but one's on hiatus. So I take care of all of the editing, scheduling, and just kind of the production side of Tales from the Kentucky Room, which Miriam hosts, and then Checked Out, which is hosted by 2 of our librarians, and it's kind of a reader's advisory kind of book club sort of thing, although recently it's been more of a here's what we've read and what we liked and what we're looking forward to. So for recording, we have, like Mary mentioned, we have the digital studio, but we haven't been using that in the pandemic. I am 100% remote, so I don't actually go into the office. So Miriam will record from a place and I will set up a recording from another place. I like to use GarageBand to edit, but lately I have used voice memos on an iPad that I've brought in and stuck in the Kentucky Room closed stacks for our staff here at Central to just go in and record an episode by themselves. And that's worked out really well because then I can just take the iPad back home with me and offload it. But what I've been using for guests that I really, really like, and right now because of all pandemic times, it's free, is Zencastr, and it's zencastr.com, and it lets you, it's like Zoom but audio only, and it lets you record each person on an individual track and then download those tracks as an MP3. If you pay for it, you can get them as a WAV file, which is just a higher quality audio file, but we don't pay for it, and I just handle the MP3s. I got really lucky in having my own work assigned Mac, so I use GarageBand for editing. I'll talk a little bit about Audacity in a little bit, but it's really easy to work with as well, I think. Another thing that I do is I do all of the mastering and the metadata. So mastering, if you've never done any sort of audio work, mastering is just how you make it sound normal. So if somebody is talking and then they start laughing really loudly, it doesn't just blow you out in your headphones when they change volume. It keeps everything nice and normal. It can also remove any background noises. One of the Linda webinars that I watched, and I think it's probably a Derek Chow one, like Carrie mentioned, recommended using alphonic.com, and it's free for up to 2 hours per month, and it is a machine leveler. So it basically just takes an algorithm and runs it over your file and levels it for you. So that cuts out about half of my editing time, because I don't have to actually do it. I can let Skynet do it for me. So, and then I add the metadata into each file. And yeah, it's weird telling a joke on a webinar because nobody can respond. So I'm just laughing by myself. I use MP3 tag because it's really, it's free, it's really easy to use as well. It seems to be PC only, so I have to switch between for work anyway. So I just have it on my work PC and do it there. There are tons and tons of MP3 taggers that let you put the metadata actually into the file of your audio file. And that just helps with searching and with when you upload it to Transistor or to whatever audio service you're using. If those things are already there, it just automatically knows it. So that's just less work for you in the service. So kind of skipping a little bit to scheduling. So when we release it, like Jefferson County, we use transistor.fm. We pay for the basic one, and we have all 3 of our podcasts, and then we also have our walking tours on there. And I really like it because it tells you all of your stats. It tells you where people are listening, and it tells you how many people are listening, how many subscribers you have, things like that. But it also lets you save them as drafts and schedule them ahead of time. So we've checked out the 2 hosts of that. They like to do their own scheduling. So all I have to do is upload it and save it as a draft, and then they can go in and make any changes that they want and then release it. But what I like to do kind of at the beginning of the year in January is look for anniversaries of things that are coming up. If we have anything that kind of coincides with that planned, the question about, how far in advance that we record, I like to have 6 months planned out and scheduled, having people come in, and then that way I can release them really easily. We've done every 3 weeks pre-pandemic, and then while we locked down, Miriam and I did one. We used Discord to do it. That was just a best of that we just talked about what we liked. But then after that, we tried a bunch of the different remote recordings, and then started doing actual interviews with each other. We did one with Alan Cutler recently. He had a book, his memoir came out last year, and so we interviewed him about that. And we had Wayne Johnson is our sports expert here at the library, so we had him guest host it. They talked for almost 2 hours, so that was was a bear to edit afterward. But it was a really great conversation, and I think everybody had a really good time doing that one. So we have been kind of around and in the local author community long enough that people really don't seem surprised when we reach out to them anymore to just be like, hey, you want to talk about it? We know that you have come into the Kentucky room for it, or, you email us a lot for help with this. Hey, do you want to actually talk about it? That was how we got Alan Cutler. I had helped him with some of the research before, just he needed some newspaper articles. And then he actually reached back out to me and was like, hey, do you want to do a library program? And I said, well, let's do a podcast because they're doing better than our virtual programs. So we did it, and it was great. So he actually reached out to us, which was pretty cool. We also have a episode that's been sort of floating around for a few months now, but I'm actually going to delay it even a little bit more for the anniversaries. Back in May of last year was the 50th anniversary of the Kent State ROTC building fire, and we did an episode about that, and it didn't get released because I had other stuff that was coming out, so I've actually decided to save it for the 51st anniversary, and we're going to release it then. So I like having just kind of episodes that are floating around kind of in the background of like, okay, I don't have anything this month, I'm going to use it. So that's just how I work. Let's see. Yeah, I would agree with that. The question is, do podcasts seem more personal or personable to people than audio, video presentations? And I think so. I also feel like it is completely on their own time. They can do it whenever they want, whatever they're doing. If they're driving, they don't have to be connected to social media to do it. They don't have to be on YouTube to do it. They can just do it whenever they want. And it also doesn't require any kind of screen to do it, really, because you just can put your headphones in and put your phone away. And I think all of us have really extreme screen burnout now. So I feel like that is a big reason why our podcasts are doing so much better than our just virtual programming in general. So we talked a little bit about this already, just kind of the pandemic restrictions, recording alone in the closed stacks, recording interviews online. I really love Zencastr, but you can't use it on mobile devices. So a couple of times we've had to switch and use WebEx, which our library pays for, but Discord is another option. I don't really like Discord so much for it because there's a lot that you have to do to get it to work, but there are a lot of remote recording softwares out there now that a lot of companies have made free because of the pandemic. The way that Checked Out records, they use a conference room and put a microphone between them, and then they just sit far apart with their masks on, and then they just email me the file. So I'm not there for those, which keeps all of us safe. And then, so getting started, I would say go as simple as you can to start. Like if you have a branch iPad, you can use that. You can get a microphone that'll plug right into it. You can use voice memos because mobile GarageBand has some audio length limits, which is really annoying. So you can use voice memos. It shows you just your waveforms automatically. You know if it's going. If you have a PC or a Mac and a microphone, you can use Audacity. It's a super simple interface. It's easy to edit with it. Then you can use Alphonic, which is free to master it, so it sounds like you recorded professionally, even if you're just using an iPad and a microphone. And then you can use SoundCloud if you're just doing one. That's a free option. If you end up doing a lot, Transistor is really reasonable. It's 15-ish a month, maybe 19 a month, and you can pay yearly or you can pay monthly. I think we pay yearly, but we really like it. Thanks, Gail. Yeah, it's really cool to be able to interview local people because that just makes it more attractive to local listeners. Because the people that you interview will be like, hey, I was on a podcast, and then you get more and more listeners that way. So I think that's all that I have, since we want to leave a little bit of time for questions. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes, absolutely, bragging rights. People will happily brag that they've been on a show.
Karen, this is Charlie. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. No, I just wanted to echo Carrie when she was talking about time for editing. I would take the length of your recording and double or triple it at least for how long it'll take you if you're going to heavily edit the ums and the ahs and the spaces. So I would just echo that. That's definitely true.
Absolutely. My question actually is about time as well, and this can be for any of you to answer. Do you have a minimum time for your podcast? Do you look for it to be an hour always? Do you want it to be at least 15 minutes kind of thing?
We've actually, some of our most popular ones have been 5 minutes long because they're just little quick listens. We did one about the street cleaner that was called the Willopus Wallopus here in Lexington, and that was one of our most popular episodes. So I try not to put out a full hour. I like to keep it to about 45 minutes because I think attention can start to waver after a certain point if you start hitting that hour mark. Subpar recordings, you can improve them certainly with, Alphonic will do it, but if you have a bad recording to start with, it's not going to get that much better. But you can definitely improve it enough so that it's workable. Like I said with the blanket, if you have somebody who's recording just using their computer microphone, you're going to get a lot of noise. So if you can ask them to put something over their head and the microphone, that will just kind of create a nice soft environment for them to record in. But we have had things like we had a guest who kept tapping the mic stand, and so they were talking and I couldn't take out the taps because it was just tap, 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 and just while they were talking. So sometimes you just have to decide what you can live with. If it's a staff person, I can just go be like, hey, you need to record this over because I can't take out, whatever this noise is that you're doing. But with our in-person guests, we do have to work with what we have. Pre-recorded materials. So like if somebody brings you an audio file already. Okay, so then you can use GarageBand has some really good editing stuff. If you don't have that, Audacity has some really nice filters that if you've got a lot of background noise, you can actually highlight it. Something from the past, I just let it sound like it's from the past. We used when we did our suffragist movement, I used something from the Library of Congress that was a recording of an opera singer in 1914 singing a song called If She's Good Enough to Be Your Baby's Mother, She's Good Enough to Vote With You. And it was staticky as all get out. It was just some pretty terrible quality, but it was amazing. So I just let it sound that way. And I think that takes some of the stress out of it. If you're going to use an archived recording, just let it sound how it's going to sound. Yes, exactly. A little bit of nostalgia. You're welcome.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to move on to our final slides. We are wrapping up. If you think of any final questions while I'm wrapping it up, please go ahead and chat those in. We can still take them once I get through our last little bit of business. We do need to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for their sponsorship of this webinar and lots of the services we provide here at KDLA. We are on social media as well, Twitter, Facebook, and working on our YouTube, so please look out for that as well. And check out our archive webinars page. This presentation will be posted there as quickly as I can get up within a week's time. Lots of other options there too, and I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat right now. The first one is to a survey about today's webinar. Please take a second real quick, just 5 short questions. We'd love to know what you thought and any other topics that you're interested in. We do look at those surveys. Very important for us to hear your opinions. The second link from Google Drive is the link to the full-size version of today's slides if you'd like to have those, and can refer back to any of the links, any of the information that was on there in kind of a more readable size than that little handout that I sent. So please feel free to reach out to our presenters if you have any follow-up questions for them. Their contact information is there on the screen. Thank you all so much for attending today, and big thank you to our presenters for sharing all this great information. Yes, I agree, Crystal. I'm like, I think I could do a podcast now. Thank you so much to Carrie and Miriam and Aaron. And everyone have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye, everybody.